Hi everyone, my name is Monica and thank you for joining me again. I have to apologize for this large gap between my last video and now, um, but I had some trouble with this chapter, which is chapter 3. And so it took me a while to get through the chapter, and then I decided to do this new format, which took me a long time to get all of the pictures and the graphics together. And then my mother got sick and was in the hospital for a couple of months. And with all of that going on, I just didn't have time to finish editing the video and everything. So we're getting to it now. And hopefully you enjoy this video. And let's get started. Today we're going to go over chapter 3. In The Fallen, The Sons of God and the Nephilim by Tim Chaffey. And this is an overview of the royalty view. The royalty view is the second oldest position and claims that the sons of God were kings, nobles, or judges. This idea was promoted around the 2nd century AD, but didn't really gain any traction. It was later brought back sometime in the 20th century and is the second most popular view today. So regarding these kings, nobles, and judges, they were perceived as ruthlessly ambitious. They apparently abused their power and forcefully took wives from among common people, aka daughters of men, and put them in their harems. There's a commentary of Genesis by Bruce Waltke and Kathy Fredericks, who mentioned that ancient Jewish interpreters who held the royalty position saw the sons of God as, quote, nobles, aristocrats, and princes who married girls outside their social status and took great numbers of them into their harem. So I guess I can understand the thinking about the daughters of men in that way, but I guess my question would be why these rulers would be considered sons of God when they are clearly corrupted. So this already has me doubting this view. But up next is Rabbi Simeon from the 2nd century, and he's said to have said that anyone who accepted the fallen angel view should be condemned. He argued that sons of God were the sons of judges and nobles who forcefully took common women as wives. And I'll have a link of this in the description. And concerning the Nephilim, another Jewish translator viewed them as, quote, powerful men who violently attacked others. Moving into modern times, author Meredith Kline said that the term Bene Ha-Elohim were polygamous tyrants from the line of Cain. So basically, Kline believes that these tyrants sinned against God by seeing grandeur and abused their power, notably by marrying scores of women. So God judged the world with a flood. Okay, so I have a little bit of trouble getting on board with this line of thinking. I just don't think that being polygamous is enough for God to destroy the whole earth. So anyway, this modern view says that the Nephilim are the offspring of these unions. However, the original Jewish position doesn't believe this. Okay, so we're going to get into the positive arguments for the royalty view, and the author, Chaffey, is using Kline's view of the royalty theory since it provides more supporting arguments. The first supporting argument is that there are a few ancient texts that have several themes in common with the first 11 chapters of Genesis. These texts usually start with a creation story and tells about the world before a great flood. Then they go on to describe how Yahweh, or the gods, wanted to destroy the world with a flood. So a man is warned to build a boat to survive. By combining the fragmented story form, the tablets of Nippur, and the Sumerian king list, Klein makes the case that the kingship before the flood came from heaven, and these rulers were considered to be gods. So Klein concludes that since the tablets and Genesis are parallel in many places, then it is divine kingship that's being described in Genesis 6, 1 through 4. The second positive argument involves more ancient texts found around ancient Israel. The rulers in these texts were sometimes considered to be gods or descended from gods. One example is from the Ugaritic epics of King Keret, or Keret bin Il, which translates as Keret, son of El. And if you remember, El is short for Elohim and used as a short for God. In this epic, Keret was supposed to be a descendant of the gods, but he was sick and dying, so the writings are sort of mocking that idea. So, quoting this passage, which describes the mourning over the sick king, there is voiced a question raised by the prospect of the death of a divine being. Quote, how can it be said, Keret is a son of El, the offspring of those two gods, which I can't pronounce, or do gods die, the offspring of the god not live? So, to me, it seems odd that they use this example as a support for their argument, since this pretty much disproves the theory that the rulers were divine. So, maybe I'm just not understanding this properly, but it seems odd to me. So, the third supporting argument tries to tie in Cain and his descendants. Cain, after he had children, Enoch was his son. He went off and built a city and named it after his son Enoch. So this sort of ties into how the sons of God are rulers. And so we're going to read Genesis 4:16 through 17. And Cain went out from the presence of Yahweh and dwelt in the land of Nod, on the east of Eden. And Cain knew his wife, and she conceived and bare Enoch. And he builded a city and called the name of the city after the name of his son Enoch. Klein argued that by the time Cain's line reached Lamech, who boasted of killing a man, the rulers had completely digressed and marriage had been completely corrupted, and Lamech had been willing to carry out vengeance through the sword of his son Tubal-Cain. So I'm not sure about this reference regarding vengeance with the sword of Tubal-Cain. Tubal-Cain is only mentioned once in the Bible, and from what I can tell, it does mention he was an expert in metallurgy, so he probably made swords. So the reference is Genesis 4:22, and Zillah, she also bare Tubal-Cain, an instructor of every artificer in brass and iron. And the sister of Tubal-Cain was Naamah. So I'm guessing that Klein is referring to Lamech as being a leader or a ruler somewhere in that time, maybe one of Cain's cities that he built, and that by killing somebody had corrupted Lamech, and so I'm just not really sure. I'm just not really sure where they're going with this. That he was just so corrupted, and then I guess when the rulers took the daughters of men, they were so corrupted they created the Nephilim, and then eventually the flood came and destroyed everyone. So other than that, I'm kind of struggling with this. Okay, so moving on to the fourth supporting argument, it involves Nimrod, who was referred to as a mighty one. So in Genesis 10:8 through 10, it says, "And Cush begat Nimrod. He began to be a mighty one in the earth. He was a mighty hunter before Yahuwah. Wherefore it is said, even as Nimrod, the mighty hunter before Yahuwah. And the beginning of his kingdom was Babel, and Erech, and Akkad, and Calneh in the land of Shinar." If you remember, mighty one in Hebrew is Gibor, which is the word used to describe the Nephilim in Genesis 6:4. So Genesis 6:4 says, "There were giants in the earth in those days, and also after that, when the sons of God came into the daughters of men, and they bare children to them. The same became mighty men, which were of old, men of renown." Since Nimrod was a ruler, stated in Genesis 10:10, which we just read, Klein then correlates the Gibborim in Genesis 6:4 to conclude that the Nephilim were human rulers. It's important to remember that in chapter 2, Chaffey says that all the Nephilim were mighty men, but not all mighty men were Nephilim. The fifth and final supporting argument is that many Bible translations translate the term Elohim as judges in a few passages. So if Elohim can be translated as human rulers, then the sons of these rulers can be the Bene Ha Elohim, that is translated as sons of God. To me, that seems a bit of a stretch, but as a side note, there's going to be a study of what Elohim actually means in chapter 4. So we'll get into that in the next video. Okay, so now that we've gone over the positives or the supporting arguments for the royalty view, now we're going to evaluate the positive arguments. So, because if Klein's arguments hold up, he would have a pretty strong case. So the first thing that we have to address are claims from the royalty view's earliest defenders, and that is the claim about taking of wives. In Genesis 6:2, it says that the sons of God saw the daughters of men, and they were fair, and they took them wives of all which they chose. So the author goes into a bit of a grammatical lesson here. So grammatically, sons of God is plural, and so wives must be also. But it doesn't necessarily denote sorry, polygamy. We noted earlier that the royalty view believes that the rulers took many wives, and the polygamous behavior was the contributing factor to God's judgment. So Genesis 6:2 is pretty ambiguous about the number of wives each son of God took. It could mean either polygamous or monogamous. So in regard to the taking of wives, the royalty view considers this term taking as forcefully taking women and placing them in their harems. However, the term taking of wives or a wife is a standard term in Genesis and doesn't have any negative connotations. The Hebrew term yikah appears in similar contexts throughout the book of Genesis in regards to men taking wives. And yikah just means obedience or compliance, and I think that that is referring to the women's obedience to God of who God's willing them to marry, and that's my perspective of it. So getting into some examples of this, the first one is Genesis 11:29, and Abram and Nahor, I don't know how to pronounce that, took them wives. The name of Abram's wife was Sarai, and the name of Nahor's wife Milcah, the daughter of Haran, the father of Milcah, and the father of Ishkah. Then, after Sarah's death, Abraham took another wife. So Genesis 25:1 says, "Then again, Abraham took a wife, and her name was Keturah." Then later in Genesis, when we're talking about Isaac, it says that he took Rebekah as his wife, and it's clear that she was willing. So Genesis 24, verses 58 and 67. So 58 says, "And they called Rebekah and said unto her, Wilt thou go with this man? And she said, I will go." Verse 67, it says, "And Isaac brought her into his mother Sarah's tent, and took Rebekah, and she became his wife. And he loved her, and Isaac was comforted after his mother's death." So one last example is about Isaac's son Esau, who took several wives. So Genesis 36:2, "Esau took his wives, the daughters of the Canaan, Adah, the daughter of Elon, the Hittite, and I am not even going to pronounce that name, the daughter of Anah, the daughter of Zibeon, the Hivite." So the term taking clearly isn't used as supposedly taking by force that the royalty view claims. Okay, so now that we've gotten the taking of wives sort of clarified, we're going to start evaluating each of the claims. So we're going to start with claim number 1, which is that there are parallels between the first 11 books of Genesis and other ancient Near Eastern writings. So it's not surprising, I think that we talked about this earlier, that Genesis 1 through 11 and these ancient texts cover the same era. An example the author gives for the possibility all these texts are similar is the Tower of Babel. So just a few generations after the flood, man decided to rebel against Yahuwah and build the tower. So Yahuwah confused their language and they scattered. These people would have known all the stories of their history and of Noah and the Great Flood. And these stories would be retold and changed over time, but would retain the core truths. So again, it's not really surprising that the Bible and other ancient texts would align in some ways. Chaffey notes that Klein overstates his case in this first argument. While some ancient nations viewed their kings as divine, Egypt being one example, ancient Sumerians and Babylonians didn't necessarily hold this view. Um, so then Chaffey introduces Henri Frankfurt here, who wrote a study on ancient religions. So Frankfurt made a compelling argument against the royalty view's belief in divine kinship, and he's quoted here. The Mesopotamians asserted that in the earliest times, and again after the flood, kingship had descended from heaven. This remarkable formula combines the awareness that kingship had not always existed with the fact that it represented the only known form of government in historical times. Moreover, the phrase indicated that the office, and not the office holder, was of superhuman origin. The majesty of kingship, the awe and sanctity of him who symbolized the community and represented it before the gods, was acknowledged, as it was in Egypt. But while the Egyptians saw Pharaoh as a god, the Mesopotamians viewed their king as a mortal endowed with divine burden. So Frankfurt believes that kings were chosen to rule by the assembly of gods. If this is an accurate representation of Sumerian and Babylonian ideas, then the parallels between the Mesopotamian writings and Genesis 1 through 11 would not support the royalty view. Personally, I'm not sure I understand this reasoning, but we'll see what happens. Next, Chaffey introduces John Walton, who has confirmed much of Frankfurt's research, and I will put a link in the description. And Walton uses a version of a text called Palm and Tamarisk. I'll put a link of the tablets in the description. Walton says that this fragmented fable explains that after the land had been founded and the gods had built the cities for humans, the gods formed a council and provided men with kingship. This here is a excerpt from his writings, and it says, a debate involving two trees, the tamarisk and the date palm. Basically, it follows the pattern of Sumerian fables, beginning with the mythological introduction, which leads up to the planting of the two trees in the first king's courtyard. The time referred to is when the gods were giving kingship to men, which occurred twice according to Sumerian history, right at the beginning of civilized life and again after the flood. It is not clear which occasion the fable refers to, though the statement, when the newly appointed king has planted the two trees, he puts on a banquet in the shade of a tamarisk and does something else in the shade of the date palm. The two trees debate their superiority, the one over the other. I tend to favor the victory of the tamarisk over the date palm because the king chose its shade first to rest, and second, based on the fact that out of the tamarisk trunk, figurines of gods were also made. Implications being that the tamarisk was noble enough to be used for the making of sacred images. So Walton acknowledges that some cultures believed their kings were divine, but the Bible states the kings were appointed by God. So he states all of this contrasts with Israelite concepts because the Bible tells us that the people requested a king, sorry for the typo there, and Yahweh grants it somewhat grudgingly. And he uses the reference out of 1 Samuel 8, 3 through 7. And his sons walked not in his ways, but turned aside after money, and took bribes, and perverted judgment. Then all the elders of Israel gathered themselves together, and came to Samuel unto Ramah, and said unto him, Behold, thou art old, and thy sons walk not in thy ways. Now make us a king to judge us like all the nations. But the thing displeased Samuel when they said, Give us a king to judge us. And Samuel prayed unto the Lord. And Yahuwah said unto Samuel, Hearken unto the voice of the people in all that they say unto thee, for they have not rejected thee, but they have rejected me, that I should not reign over them. Okay, so switching gears a little bit and going back to Klein and his royalty view argument, referencing the Sumerian king list, Klein points to the excessively long lifespans given for its rulers. If the king list were to parallel any of Genesis 1 through 11, it would be the genealogy given in chapter 5 of the Bible, the Sethite line from Adam to Noah. However, Klein's focuses on Cain's line. So I kind of think this comparison is a bit of a stretch, considering the king list gives examples of some rulers ruling for at least 20,000 years, as opposed to the Sethite line. Their lifespans were, around 900 years. So with this, I feel like they're kind of, both sides of the argument are kind of picking and choosing, and I'm a little confused about this, and so I'm not really convinced either way. Okay, so moving on to the evaluation of claim number 2. If you remember, claim number 2 involves a certain King Keret who was considered a god. In the Ugaritic epic of King Keret, he is called the son of El. However, in the story, his divine nature is called into question by the fact that he is sick and dying. So not a very strong view for the royalty view, so I'm not sure why they included it, but it's just kind of weird. But so like the Egyptians, the Ugaritic people in the land of Canaan may have viewed their kings as divine, but except maybe for King Keret, which they were having doubts, I guess. But they don't have any close parallels to Genesis 1 through 11. Okay, so evaluation of claim number 3. The third claim involves Cain and his descendants through Lamech. Cain built a city in which his descendants ruled. By the time Lamech became a ruler, they had completely transgressed God's original instructions, and their marriages had been corrupted. Chaffey believes this is the weakest argument, and it's based mostly on speculation. So let's compare what Klein says with Genesis chapter 4. And we'll start with a quote from Klein supporting his royalty view. So, quote, In Cain's dedication of his city to the name of his heir, there was foreshadowed the lust for a name that was increasingly to mark these city rulers until when the city-states began to be theocratically conceived, they esteemed themselves veritable sons of gods, and so men of name, indeed. Outstanding representative of the Cainite dynasty was Lamech. Concerning his court life, it is recorded that he practiced bigamy, and of his royal enforcement of law, it is witnessed out of his own mouth that his policy was one of tyranny, a tyranny that reckoned itself the power of the sword of Tubal Cain, more competent for vengeance than God himself. So I guess this explains my confusion earlier. First with, claiming that they are the sons of God, because they sort of lusted after glory, um, and, esteemed themselves veritable sons of God. So um, that explains that. And then later on, when I was confused about the Tubal-Cain reference, so Lamech just thought himself more powerful than God, um, through his tyranny with the sword produced by Tubal-Cain. So that makes more sense now. So let's go over some Bible verses that Cain references to support this theory. The first verse will references Genesis 6:4, which he uses to reference that they esteemed themselves veritable sons of God, and so men of name. So Genesis 6:4 says, "There were giants in the earth in those days, and also thereafter, when the sons of God came into the daughters of men, and they bare children to them. The same became mighty men, became mighty men which were of old, men of renown." Next up is Genesis 4:19. In reference to Lamech's bigamy. So Genesis 4:19, "And Lamech took unto him 2 wives, the name of one which was Ada, and the name of the other Zillah." And finally, we have Genesis 4:23 to 24, about his tyranny. So it says, "And Lamech said unto his wives, Ada and Zillah, hear my voice, ye wives of Lamech, hearken unto my speech, for I have slain a man to my wounding, and a young man to my hurt. If Cain shall be avenged sevenfold, truly Lamech 70 and sevenfold." And gosh, I've got a lot of typos. I need to do better for my next video. Okay, since Cain built a city, it wouldn't be unreasonable to think that he ruled over it. However, there's nothing biblical stating that any of Cain's descendants remained in or ruled that city after him. Personally, I think that it's likely they did. But there's nothing about city-states or any mention of anyone else besides Lamech who wanted to, quote-unquote, make a name for themselves. And there's nothing to indicate that any of Cain's descendants viewed themselves as veritable sons of God. It's pretty much all speculation. Chaffey does admit that Klein may be right on some of these points about Cain and his line, but there's no biblical evidence to prove any of it. Concerning Lamech, it's possible he may have ruled over a certain region, since his son Jabal was the father of those who lived in tents and kept livestock, which we see in Genesis 4:20. And his other son, Jubal, was the father of those who played the harp and flute, which is Genesis 4:21. Lamech's second wife bore him Tubal-Cain, the forger of bronze and iron instruments. And it seems likely that Lamech would have to be someone of significant authority if his sons were leaders and inventors. So Klein would use these references as solid fact to prove his theory that Cain's line was the sons of God mentioned in Genesis 2:6, when ultimately all his claims are speculative. And I just said Genesis 2:6 there, but I meant Genesis 6:2. So, okay, moving on to evaluation of claim number 4, which involves Nimrod and the period of the Tower of Babel. Let's see, we're going to read Genesis 11:1 through 9. "And the whole earth was of one language and of one speech. And it came to pass, as they journeyed from the east, that they found a plain in the land of Shinar, and they dwelt there. And they said to one another, Go to, let us make brick, and burn them thoroughly. And they had brick for stone, and slime had they for mortar. And they said, Go to, let us build us a city and a tower, whose top may reach unto heaven. And let us make us a name, lest we be scattered abroad upon the face of the whole earth. And Yahweh came down to see the city and the tower, which the children of men builded. And Yahweh said, Behold, the people is one, and they have all one language. And this they begin to do, and now nothing will be restrained from them, which they have imagined to do. Go to, let us go down, and there confound their language, that they may not understand one another's speech. So Yahweh scattered them abroad from thence upon the face of all the earth, and they left off to build the city. Therefore is the name of it called Babel, because Yahweh did there confound the language of all the earth, and from thence did Yahweh scatter them abroad upon the face of the earth. So Nimrod was around during this period, and one thing that is clear is that Nimrod was a mighty man and a ruler. There does seem to be some confusion as to when Nimrod was a ruler and why. And according to Klein, Nimrod was Nephilim because he was described as Gibor, or a mighty man, and the royalty view states that mighty men are members of ruling families. However, it's not mentioned that Nimrod is from a ruling family. So in Genesis 10:8 through 10, it describes his achievements. And Cush begat Nimrod. He began to be a mighty one in the earth. He was a mighty hunter before Yahweh. Wherefore it is said, even as Nimrod the mighty hunter before Yahweh. And the beginning of his kingdom was Babel, and Erech, and Akkad, and Calneh in the land of Shinar. So also in this passage, it seems to imply that he became a ruler after the Tower of Babel was destroyed. But Chaffey will discuss that further in the book. Another weakness in the royalty view is that not all men described as mighty men were rulers. In 1 Samuel 16:18, David was described as a mighty man of valor and a man of war, and this was before he fought Goliath. So it says, Then answered one of the servants and said, Behold, I have seen a son of Jesse the Bethlehemite, that he is cunning in playing, and a mighty valiant man, and a man of war, and a prudent in matters, and a comely person, and Yahweh is with him. Also in 2 Samuel chapter 23, which we won't read the whole chapter here, it says that David had a group of mighty men, Geborim, who served as warriors in his army. Also in 2 Chronicles 17:14 through 16, it says that Jehoshaphat sorry, had at least 780,000 mighty men at his disposal. So 2 Chronicles 17:14 through 16, and these are the numbers of them according to the house of their fathers. Of Judah, the captains of thousands, Adnah the chief, and with him mighty men of valor, 300,000. And next to him was Jehohanan the captain, with him 280,000. And next to him was Amasiah, the son of Zechri, who willingly offered himself unto Yahweh, and with him 200,000 mighty men of valor. And then in Chronicles 25:6, it says that Amaziah hired 100,000 mighty men from Israel. So it reads, he hired 100,000 mighty men of valor out of Israel for 100 talents of silver. So it never mentions in any of these verses that mighty men were of nobility. So the Hebrew term Gibor or Giborim is most often used to describe warriors rather than the ruling class. In the case of Nephilim, they were giants, then they were mighty men. However, there were many mighty men who were not giants. So Chaffey concludes that Klein has incorrectly taken the term Gibor to apply only to the ruling class. Okay, so the final claim, number 5, deals with the term Elohim and Bene Ha-Elohim, which Klein interprets to mean judges. So some Bible translations interpret Elohim as judges. The Klein's claim that Elohim can refer to human judges implies that the sons of these judges or rulers should be referred to as Bene Ha-Elohim or sons of God. So the examination of this claim requires significant examination. So Chaffey's going to address it in chapter 4 as kind of doing a deep dive into what Elohim actually means. Okay, so conclusion. In my opinion, Chaffey doesn't agree with the royalty view and says that Klein and his colleagues fall short in building a case. I think that the royalty view and Chaffey's arguments against it seem to be kind of picking and choosing details. So this view is kind of confusing to me, and I don't think either argument fully makes a lot of sense. I mean, some of it makes sense and some of it doesn't. So, anyway, Chaffey says that Klein's view fails to acknowledge ancient resources that are consistent with the supernatural interpretation of Genesis 6, 1 through 4. In a popular commentary, I don't know how to pronounce their names, but they say the royalty view may be dismissed at once as not warranted by the usages of the language and as altogether unscriptural. Another author named Alan Ross concludes in his summary of the royalty view, quote, the view that interprets the sons of God solely as powerful rulers does not, in my opinion, make enough use of the literary connections with pagan literature. The expressions sons of God, when taken in context of these verses and when viewed against the background of the ancient Near East, suggests that more than powerful rulers are involved. Moreover, the expression of the Bible refers to angels. And sorry again for those typos. I think at the end of this, my eyes were going cross-eyed. So that's why there's so many typos. But anyway, the author, Alan Ross, uses Job 1:6 as a reference for his statement. And Job 1:6 says, now there was a day when the sons of God came to present themselves before Yahweh, and Satan came also among them. So clearly in Job 1:6, the sons of God are clearly referenced as angels. and Satan, of course, was the fallen angel, and he was there as well. So Chaffey's view of the royalty view is a better explanation of Genesis 6, 1 through 4 than the Sethite theory, but Chaffey still feels that it falls short, and I tend to agree with that. Okay, so that concludes the chapter 3. Go ahead and leave me some comments if you'd like, and maybe we can discuss this chapter, because I wasn't really convinced either way necessarily, and I was confused about a little bit. So let me know if you have any ideas or opinions about the royalty view. I'd be happy to read them. So next video is going to be chapter 4. What does Elohim mean? And so the fifth royalty argument says that Elohim refers to judges, but does it really? So chapter 4 is just an in-depth study into what Elohim truly means. So I will see you then. Thanks for listening. I really appreciate it. And leave a like and a comment. Thank you.